Picture this: a dusty Oklahoma street. 1933. The morning sun beats down on a line of black sedans parked outside Union Station in Kansas City. Federal agents stand ready, their fingers hovering near their holsters. They've just captured one, America's most wanted criminals, after years of hunting him across state lines. In moments, they'll escort him inside. In moments, everything will go wrong. What happens next will become one of the most infamous massacres in American criminal history. And at the center of it all lies a name whispered in speakeasies and feared in bank vaults across the Midwest. Frank Nash. Before we dive into the blood-soaked legend of the man they called Jelly, I want to know something. Where are you watching this from right now? You tucked away in your room late at night, headphones on, diving deep into the criminal underworld? Or maybe you're watching this during your morning commute, your lunch break, escaping into a world most people only see in movies. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're from and what time you're watching this. I love hearing from you, and it helps me understand this community we're building together, one dark story at a time. Now let me take you back. Back before the FBI became the untouchable force it is today. Back when the lines between lawman and outlaw blurred like whiskey and water. Back to the dirt roads of Arkansas and Oklahoma, where a farm boy with a quick trigger finger would rise to become one of the most feared gangsters America had ever seen. This is the story of Frank Nash, train robber, bank heist mastermind, prison, escapee, a man whose very name could empty a saloon or fill a cemetery. His legacy wasn't written in ledgers or history books. It was carved in gunpowder, blood, and betrayal. Are you ready? Then let's step into the shadows. Asterisk, every monster has an origin story. And Frank Nash's begins not in the glittering underworld of organized crime, but in the hard-scrabble poverty of rural America at the turn of the 20th century. Born on February 6, 1887, in Birdseye, Indiana, Frank Nash entered a world that offered little and demanded everything. His family, like countless others, were swept up in the great American migration westward. Chasing promises of land and opportunity that rarely materialized the way that railroad posters promised, the Nash family eventually settled in Oklahoma. Territory, a place so raw and untamed it wouldn't even achieve statehood until Frank was 20 years old. This was Indian Territory, a lawless frontier where justice came from the barrel of a gun more often than from a courthouse. Young Frank grew up watching his father break his back farming land that seemed determined to yield nothing but dust and disappointment. He watched his mother's hands crack and bleed from endless washing, cooking, and mending. He watched his siblings go to bed hungry more nights than not. But Frank Nash wasn't built for watching. Even as a boy, there was something restless coiled inside him, something that couldn't be tamed by Sunday sermons or the promise of an honest day's work. His teachers, when he bothered to show up to the one-room schoolhouse, noted his quick mind and quicker temper. He could calculate figures in his head faster than most men could with pencil and paper. But he had no patience for authority, no tolerance for being told what to do. By the time Frank hit his teenage years, he'd already developed a reputation around their small community. He wasn't a bully in the traditional sense. He didn't pick on smaller kids or torment animals, but cross him, challenge him, or worse, disrespect him. And you'd find yourself staring down a cold fury that seemed disproportionate to whatever slight had triggered it. Frank Nash didn't just want respect. God, he demanded it, and he was willing to fight for it with his fists if necessary. His first brush with the law came at 16. The local general store owner accused Frank of stealing a can of tobacco and some ammunition, of all things. Whether Frank actually took them remains a mystery lost to time, but what isn't mysterious is what happened next. When the store owner confronted Frank's father, demanding payment or prosecution, Frank didn't hang his head in shame. He didn't beg forgiveness. Instead, he looked that store owner dead in the eye and told him that if he ever spoke to his father again, he'd regret it. 2 nights later, the general store's window was smashed. Nothing was stolen. It was a message, pure and simple. And everyone in town understood exactly who had sent it. Frank's father, a God-fearing man who believed in turning the other cheek, tried to beat the devil out of his son with a leather strap. But if he hoped to break Frank's spirit, he failed. Miserably. Each lash only hardened something inside the boy, transforming pain into fuel for a growing rage against a world that seemed designed to keep people like him down. After that beating, Frank looked at his father differently. Not with fear, but with something closer to pity. His father had accepted his lot in life. Frank never would. At 18, Frank left home for good. He didn't run away in the middle of the night like some scared kid. He simply announced one morning that he was leaving, packed what little he owned into a canvas bag, and walked out the door while his mother wept and his father stared silently into his coffee. Frank headed for the oil fields, where rough men did rough work for good money, where questions about your past were considered impolite at best and dangerous at worst. The oil boom in early 1900s Oklahoma was like nothing America had seen before. Overnight, towns sprouted from nothing. Fortunes were made and lost before breakfast. Into this churning chaos walked Frank Nash, still just a kid but already carrying himself like a man who'd seen and done things that would make others flinch. He hired on as a roughneck, doing back-breaking labor in the drilling fields. The work was brutal. Men were maimed or killed with disturbing regularity, their bodies crushed by machinery or burned by gushers of crude oil that erupted without warning. But Frank thrived in this environment. He discovered he had a talent for improvising solutions to mechanical problems, for thinking on his feet when equipment failed and seconds meant the difference between containing a situation and catastrophic disaster. More importantly, he discovered he had a talent for cards. In the rough gambling dens and tent saloons that followed the oil crews from field to field, Frank found he could read men better than he'd ever read books, could spot a bluff, sense desperation, and calculate odds while maintaining a face. As blank as fresh paper, it was in these smoky back rooms, surrounded by men who settled disputes with knives and fists, that Frank Nash received his real education. He learned that the world was divided into two types of people: predators and prey. He learned that the law was something rich men used to protect themselves and punish the poor. He learned that loyalty was bought, respect was earned, and fear was the most reliable currency of all, and he learned how easy it was to cheat. Frank's first arrest came in 1913, when he was 26 years old. He and two partners had been running a crooked dice game in a lumber camp outside of Sapulpa, Oklahoma. They'd been skimming money for weeks, but they got greedy. When a lumberjack accused them of using loaded dice, Frank didn't try to talk his way out of it. He didn't run. Instead, he pulled a revolver, his first gun. A .38 special he'd bought with his gambling winnings, and pistol-whipped the accuser into unconsciousness. The local sheriff, a man named Bill Tillman, who would later become a legend, in his own right, arrested Frank without incident. Tillman was one of the old-school lawmen. It's the kind who could walk into a room full of armed criminals and command silence with nothing but his presence. When he told Frank to put his hands up, Frank complied. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. He saw in Tillman a kindred spirit, a man who had carved out his place in the world through force of will. Wasn't about to let some punk kid with a stolen gun change the. Frank served 60 days in the county jail, and those 60 days changed the trajectory of his life. In jail, Frank met real criminals for the first time. Not amateur card cheats and petty thieves, but professionals. Safecrackers who could hear the tumblers in a lock like musicians heard notes. Con men who could sell you your own horse and make you thank them for the privilege. And bank robbers who spoke about their craft with the same pride. A master carpenter might discuss hand-carved furniture. These men saw something in Frank Nash. Maybe it was his intelligence, his complete lack of fear, or his obvious hunger for something more than what honest life offered. It took him under their wing, teaching him in those 60 days more than he'd learned in his entire life up to that point. They taught him how to case a bank, how to plan an escape route, how to fence stolen goods. They taught him that the real money wasn't in small-time gambling or stealing from drunks, it was in going after banks and trains. The institutions that held the wealth of entire communities. But most importantly, they taught him something that would define the rest of Frank Nash's life. Never leave witnesses. never show mercy. And never, ever trust the law to keep you safe. When Frank walked out of that jail in the summer of 1913, he was no longer the angry kid from the oil fields. He was a student of crime, and he was ready to graduate. His first bank robbery was almost laughably simple. A small-town bank in Cordell, Oklahoma, with one elderly security guard and a safe that was barely more sophisticated than a lockbox. Frank and two partners from his jail stint walked in 15 minutes before closing on a Friday afternoon. Masks covering their faces, guns drawn. They made off with $4,000 more money than Frank had seen in his entire life combined. They split it 3 ways and agreed to lay low for a few months, let the heat die down. But Frank couldn't stay away. The thrill of it, the pure adrenaline rush of walking into a place protected by laws and society and taking whatever he wanted, it was intoxicating. More than the money, more than anything, Frank had finally found what he was good at. Over the next few years, Nash became a regular fixture on wanted posters throughout Oklahoma and Arkansas. He robbed banks with a cold efficiency that terrified witnesses. Unlike some outlaws who played to the crowd, who saw themselves as Robin Hood figures fighting against corrupt institutions, Frank had no illusions about what he was. He was a thief, pure and simple, and he was very, very good at it. But it was the trains that would make him famous. Robbing trains required a different skill set than banks. You needed more men, better planning, and the nerve to stop a massive piece of machinery carrying armed guards and potentially dozens of witnesses. The rewards, however, were worth the risk. Mail cars often carried payrolls for entire mining, operations, or oil companies. Express cars held cash being transferred between banks. The passengers themselves, especially in first class, could be carrying small fortunes in jewelry and cash. Frank's first train robbery happened on a cold October night in 1920. He and 5 other men stopped the Katy Railroad near Oklahoma, by piling ties on the tracks. When the engineers slowed to investigate, they swarmed the train like a military operation. Frank himself held the passengers in the first-class car at gunpoint, while his partners cleaned out the express car and mail car. They made off with close to $40,000, a staggering sum for the time. The newspapers ate it up. Suddenly, Frank Jelly Nash Heed picked up the nickname. Jelly, for his slick-back hair and smooth way of talking, was front-page news. The stories painted him as a daring outlaw, a throwback to the Wild West in an increasingly modern world. What the newspapers didn't mention was the conductor Frank had pistol-whipped when the man tried to be a hero, or the young woman in first. Class who would have nightmares about the cold eyes staring at her through that mask for the rest of her life. Frank didn't care about any of that. All he cared about was that he'd finally become somebody. People knew his name. They feared it. And for a boy who'd grown up invisible, wearing hand-me-down clothes and eating table scraps, that fear tasted sweeter than any whiskey. But fame, as Frank would learn, comes with a price. And that price was already being calculated by men in federal offices who were getting tired of outlaws like Frank Nash making the government look foolish. The hunt was on. And Frank Nash, barely 33 years old and at the height of his criminal powers, had no idea that his next arrest would lead him down a path that would end with one of the most shocking massacres in American history. Asterisk, the 1920s roared too. Life with jazz, bootleg liquor, and a level of lawlessness that made the old frontier days look tame by comparison. Prohibition hadn't eliminated drinking, it had just criminalized it. And in doing so, created the most profitable criminal enterprise America had ever seen. For men like Frank Nash, who already operated outside the law, the new decade offered opportunities beyond their wildest dreams. But Frank was no bootlegger. While other criminals were getting rich running speakeasies and smuggling Canadian whiskey across the border, Frank stayed true to his first love, robbery. Banks, trains, and the occasional armored cars, these were his targets. And he approached each job with the meticulous planning of a general preparing for war. By 1921, Frank had assembled what law enforcement would later call one of the most sophisticated criminal networks in the Midwest. This wasn't a gang in the traditional sense, not like the structured organizations that controlled Chicago or New York. Instead, Frank operated with a rotating crew of specialists. For each job, he'd handpick the men he needed: expert drivers, gunslingers, inside men who could provide intelligence about security measures and cash movements, and mechanics who could soup up getaway cars to outrun police vehicles. What's set apart from other criminals of his era was his professionalism. He didn't drink before jobs. He didn't bring women into his confidence. He didn't brag about his exploits in saloons or tip his hand to law enforcement through careless talk. Frank understood what many of his contemporaries didn't in the crime business. The flashy outlaws always got caught. It was the quiet, methodical ones who lasted. His base of operations shifted constantly. One month, he'd be in Hot Springs, Arkansas, a town so corrupt that it essentially functioned as a sanctuary city for criminals on the run. The police chief there, it was rumored, kept a ledger of wanted men staying in town and charged them a weekly fee for the privilege of not being arrested. Frank paid his dues like everyone else and enjoyed the hot baths, horse races, and temporary peace that Hot Springs offered. Other times, he'd hide out on farms owned by sympathetic families' folks who'd been burned by banks during agricultural crises and had no love for the institutions Frank targeted. These farmers would get a generous cut for keeping Frank hidden and their mouths shut. It was a relationship built on mutual benefit and sealed with cash, which Frank had learned was far more reliable than loyalty or friendship. The jobs themselves became increasingly ambitious. In April 1922, Frank and his crew hit 3 banks. In 3 different towns over a 5-day span, a blitzkrieg approach that left law enforcement scrambling and confused. While police in one county were investigating his robbery, Frank was 2 counties over, already planning the next one. He was always moving, always thinking 2 steps ahead, and it drove federal agents absolutely crazy. One particular robbery entered into criminal legend and showed both Frank's brilliance and his brutality. In September 1922, Frank learned through an inside contact that a small bank in Pocala, Oklahoma, would be receiving a shipment of $25,000 to cover payroll for nearby mining operations. The bank had hired 2 additional guards for the day, thinking the extra security would deter any would-be robbers. Frank saw it differently. He spent 2 weeks planning the job, which was unusually long for him. He studied the guards' routines, timed the local police patrol patterns, and even rented a room across from the bank under a false name so he could observe the daily rhythms of the business. When the day came, Frank's crew didn't hit during business hours like most bank robbers. Instead, they waited until closing time. When the staff was preparing to leave and their guard was down, they entered through the back door. An inside man had left it unlocked and held the bank manager and his family hostage in the man's own home until the next morning. Frank wasn't needlessly cruel to them. In fact, witnesses later said he was almost polite, apologizing for the inconvenience, while keeping a gun trained on the manager's wife. When morning came, the manager opened the vault as instructed. Frank's crew cleaned it out while the man's family remained under guard miles away by the time authorities realized what had happened. Frank and his men were already across state lines, the money divided and hidden in a dozen different locations. The manager, terrified for his family's safety, told police he never got a good look at any of the robbers' faces. Frank had covered every angle, thought of every contingency. It was law enforcement later admitted a perfect crime, but perfection breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds mistakes. In October 1924, Frank made his first major error. He'd become romantically involved with a woman named Frances Luce, beauty from Oklahoma, with expensive tastes and a talent for spending money faster than Frank could steal it. Frances knew what Frank did for a living. She wasn't naive or innocent-tanned. The danger of it thrilled her. She loved the lifestyle, the nice clothes, the hotel suites, the feeling of being connected to someone important in the underworld. What Frances didn't understand was that in Frank's world, it's the only thing more dangerous than the law was love. It made you predictable, gave you patterns, and patterns were how men got caught. Federal agents, led by a determined marshal named William Billy Roth, had been tracking Frank for 3 years with little success. Roth was different from the local sheriffs Frank was used to evading. Was educated, patient, and understood that catching a criminal like Frank Nash required outthinking him, not outgunning him.
Oh.
When Roth learned about Frances, he saw his opening. They put Frances under surveillance, watching her movements, tracking her purchases, monitoring who she corresponded with. It took months, but eventually Frances led them straight to Frank. On a cold December evening in 1924, Frances checked into a hotel in Tulsa under her real name, a mistake Frank had specifically told her never to make. Federal agents surrounded the hotel. When Frank stepped out the next morning to buy a newspaper, they were waiting. For the first time in his adult life, Frank Nash was completely caught off guard. He reached for the pistol in his coat, but a marshal already had a shotgun pressed against his spine. "Please try it, Jelly," the marshal said quietly. "I'd love an excuse." Frank's hands slowly rose. He was 37 years old, at the peak of his criminal career. And he'd just made the rookie mistake of trusting his heart more than his head. As they handcuffed him, Frank looked back at the hotel window where Frances stood watching tears streaming down her face. He never spoke to her again. The trial was swift. Frank's lawyer, paid for with hidden robbery money, argued that the evidence was circumstantial. The federal government couldn't prove Frank Nash had robbed any specific bank. Well, the prosecution didn't need to prove one specific robbery. They had witnesses from half a dozen different jobs who identified Frank in the courtroom, bank managers who'd looked down the barrel of his gun, train conductors who'd been forced to their knees, a young bank teller who still flinched when doors opened too quickly because she remembered. Frank bursting through them with his face covered and his gun raised. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, the judge, a severe man who'd seen the violence of the frontier days and had no romance for outlaws, sentenced Frank Nash to 25 years in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas. Frank would be 62 when he got out, an old man, if he survived it all. As they led him away in chains, a reporter shouted a question. "Nash, do you regret anything you've done?" Frank stopped, looked back, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face that might have been genuine emotion. But when he spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless. "I regret getting caught." Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary was hell on earth, a massive stone fortress that housed America's most dangerous criminals. Frank entered in early 1925, just another number in a gray uniform, stripped of his name and his identity. The authorities thought they'd broken him. That prison would crush whatever remained of the notorious Jelly Nash. They couldn't have been more wrong. If anything, Leavenworth was. Like going back to graduate school for Frank, he reconnected with old criminal associates and made new ones. Bank robbers, murderers, bootleggers, gangsters from Kansas City and Chicago, they were all there. They all recognized Frank Nash. His reputation had preceded him. And in the strange social hierarchy of prison, Frank found himself near the top. He became friends with a safecracker named Tommy Holden, a genius with explosives who could blow a vault door clean off its hinges without damaging the contents inside. He spent hours talking with a con man who'd defrauded banks of over $1 million, using nothing but forged documents and charm. He learned from a Chicago enforcer the finer points of intimidation and how to instill fear with just a look or a quietly spoken word. But Frank didn't just network and learn. He planned. Every day, every conversation, every observation was cataloged in his mind as he built a blueprint for something that seemed impossible: escape. Leavenworth wasn't some county jail with one board guard and a rusty lock. This was a federal institution with hundreds of guards, stone walls, 30 feet high, armed towers at every corner, and protocols designed specifically to prevent what Frank was contemplating. Men had tried to escape before. Most had failed. Those who made it over the walls were usually caught within hours, and their recapture often ended in bullets. But Frank had advantages most prisoners didn't. He had money hidden on the outside, cash that Frances didn't know about, buried in different locations and held by trusted associates. He had connections throughout the criminal underworld who owed him favors or who might help for the right price. Most importantly, he had patience. Frank understood that rushing an escape would end in failure or death. He needed time, and he needed the perfect opportunity. That opportunity came in October 1930, more than 5 years after Frank first entered Leavenworth. By then, he'd become a model prisoner in the eyes of the guards. He worked in the prison woodshop, kept his head down, never caused trouble. Guards who'd initially been wary of the famous train robber had relaxed around him. He was middle-aged now, his hair graying at the temples, his body carrying a few more pounds than in his outlaw days. He looked domesticated, broken, harmless. It was all an act. The escape was breathtakingly simple, which is what made it brilliant. Frank and Tommy Holden had befriended a guard, a younger man from a poor family who was drowning in debt. They didn't threaten him or try to force him, that would have been too risky. Instead, they offered him money. A lot of money. $5,000 each, more than the guard would make in 3 years of honest work. All he had to do was leave. One gate unlocked and be somewhere else when Frank and Tommy walked through it. On October 19, 1930, during a routine work detail in the prison yard, Frank and Tommy simply walked away. They crossed the yard, went through the unlocked gate, and disappeared into a waiting car driven by an associate Frank had contacted through coded letters. By the time guards realized they were missing, Frank and Tommy were already 50 miles away, their prison uniforms discarded in a ditch, their faces clean-shaven, looking like respectable businessmen heading to a meeting. The escape made national headlines. The federal government was humiliated. Leavenworth was supposed to be escape-proof, and yet 2 of its most notorious inmates had walked out like they were leaving a hotel. The warden was fired. The guard who'd helped them disappeared, with his money, and was never seen again. And Frank Nash, the train robber from Arkansas, who was supposed to rot in prison until he was an old man, was free again. But freedom came with a price. Every federal agent in the country now had Frank's picture. His face was in post offices, police stations, and newspaper offices from coast to coast. He was 53 years old, too old to be climbing over bank counters or jumping onto moving trains. The world had changed while he was inside. Prohibition was ending. The FBI was growing more sophisticated, more organized, more dangerous. Frank knew he couldn't go back to his old life. The day of the independent outlaw was ending. If he wanted to survive, he needed to adapt. And adaptation meant hooking up with the new breed of criminals, the organized syndicates that were taking over cities and turning crime into a business. Frank headed to Kansas City, where an old prison friend named Johnny Lazia controlled the Underworld. Lazia welcomed Frank with open arms. In the new criminal landscape, a man with Frank's skills and reputation was valuable. He could plan jobs, lead crews, and his name still carried weight. For nearly 3 years, Frank lived in Kansas City, working as a freelance criminal for hire. He helped plan bank robberies, served as muscle for bootlegging operations, and occasionally did enforcement work for Lazia's organization. He lived well, stayed relatively safe, started to believe he might actually get away with it. But the federal government never forgot. And in early 1933, after years of investigation, they finally got a solid lead on Frank's whereabouts. This time, they weren't going to let him slip away. This time, they were bringing an army. And this time, the arrest would trigger a chain of events that would end in a massacre unlike anything America had ever seen. Asterisk, the America that Frank Nash merged into after his escape from Leavenworth was dramatically different from the one he'd left behind when they locked him up. The stock market had crashed in 1929, plunging the nation into the Great Depression. Banks that Frank had once robbed with impunity were now failing on their own, taking the life savings of ordinary people with them. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Dust storms ravaged the farmlands of Oklahoma and Arkansas where Frank had grown up. The country was broken, desperate, and angry. In this chaos, criminals like Frank found themselves in a strange position. To many Americans, bank robbers weren't villains anymore. They were folk heroes striking back against the institutions that had stolen their futures. John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Bonnie and Clyde. Pretty Boy Floyd, these names captured the public imagination in ways that terrified federal authorities. The criminals were becoming more famous than the lawmen chasing them. And that was a Problemj Edgar Hoover. The ambitious director of the Bureau of Investigation, not yet called, the FBI understood that his organization needed wins. Public. Victories that would restore faith in federal law enforcement. And high on his list of targets was Frank "Jelly" Nash, the escaped convict who'd made the federal prison system look foolish. The agent assigned to hunt Frank was a man named Joe Lackey, a Texas-born lawman with a reputation for persistence. Lackey wasn't flashy or famous. He didn't give interviews to newspapers or pose for photographs. He was a bureaucrat with a badge, methodical and patient. The kind of man who would follow a cold trail for months if it meant eventually getting his man. Lackey spent 2 years tracking Frank, following leads that more often than not went nowhere. For every tip that panned out, 10 others were false alarms. Sightings of men who looked like Frank but weren't, or information from informants trying to collect reward money for intelligence they'd made up. But Lackey kept at it, slowly building a picture of Frank's movements, his associates, his patterns. The break came from an unexpected source: vanity. Frank, now in his mid-40s and acutely aware that his outlaw days were numbered, had begun visiting a dentist in Kansas City for extensive dental work. He was getting fitted for gold teeth, a status symbol in the criminal underworld. The dentist, a nervous man who suspected his patient might be someone wanted by the law, but was too afraid to ask, eventually contacted authorities after seeing a wanted poster at the post office. Lackey received the tip in early June 1933 and immediately began surveillance of the dental office. Sure enough, Frank showed up for an appointment on June 16th. Lackey and 2 other agents followed him from the dentist's office to a house on the outskirts of Kansas City, a safe house owned by an associate of Johnny Lazia's organization. 4. The next 24 hours, federal agents watched the house, waiting for the right moment. They couldn't just burst in. Frank was undoubtedly armed, and a shootout could result in dead agents or dead bystanders. They needed to catch him in the open, away from reinforcements. In a situation where he couldn't shoot his way out, that opportunity came on the morning of June 17, 1933. Frank emerged from the house around 9 a.m., dressed in a nice suit, freshly shaved, looking every bit the prosperous businessman rather than a fugitive from justice. He walked to a car parked on the street, apparently planning to drive somewhere. He never made it to the car. Lackey and 4 other agents swarmed Frank before he could even reach for the door handle. It came from multiple directions, guns drawn, shouting for him to raise his hands. For a long moment, Frank stood frozen, and everyone present later said they could see him calculating his chances. His hand drifted toward his coat, where they'd later find a loaded .45 automatic. "Don't do it, Jelly," Lackey said quietly, his own pistol aimed at Frank's chest. "We're taking you alive if we can, but dead works just fine for the paperwork." Frank's hand stopped. His shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. He raised his hands and spoke his first words of the encounter. "You boys finally caught me on an empty stomach. At least let me get some breakfast before you haul me in." They actually did. Lackey, relieved there hadn't been a shooting, allowed his prisoner one last meal as a free man at a nearby diner. Frank ordered steak and eggs, ate slowly, and made small talk with the agents, like they were old friends catching up. He was charming, funny even, telling stories about his robberies that had the younger agents laughing despite themselves. One of them would later say that eating breakfast with Frank Nash was one of the most surreal experiences of his career. Sitting across from a notorious criminal who seemed completely at peace with his capture, but beneath that calm exterior, Frank's mind was racing. He knew what recapture meant. He was an escaped federal prisoner who'd made the government look foolish. They wouldn't just send him back to Leavenworth, they'd make an example of him. Maximum security. Solitary confinement. They'd bury him so deep in the prison system that he'd never see daylight again. He'd die in a cell, forgotten and alone. And that thought terrified him more than any bullet ever could. After breakfast, they handcuffed him and began the journey back to Leavenworth. The original plan was to drive Frank the entire way, but Lackey, concerned about the possibility of an ambush by Frank's criminal associates, made a last-minute decision to take him by train instead. They would board the Missouri Pacific Railroad to Kansas City's Union Station, then transfer to Fort Smith, Arkansas, before finally making their way to Leavenworth. That decision to use trains a mode of transportation Frank had robbed more times than anyone could count would prove to be fatally ironic. They arrived at Union Station in Kansas City on the morning of June 17th. Planning to catch the 7:15 a.m. train to Fort Smith, Union Station was a massive, beautiful building, a cathedral. To the golden age of railroad travel with its soaring ceilings and marble floors, on that particular morning, it was crowded with travelers, families seeing loved ones off, businessmen catching early trains. Lackey and his men moved through the station quickly. Frank handcuffed between two agents, trying to attract as little attention as possible. But you can't move a notorious criminal through a public space without someone noticing. And Union Station that morning had more eyes on it than the federal agents realized. Kansas City, in 1933, was controlled by political boss Tom Pendergast and his criminal enforcer, Johnny Lazia. They ran the city like their personal fiefdom, with police on the payroll, judges in their pocket, and a network of informants throughout every level of society. When Frank Nash was captured, word reached Lazia within hours. And when Lazia learned that federal agents planned to transport Frank through Union Station, he faced a decision. Frank Nash had worked for Lazia's organization. More importantly, Frank knew things, names, operations, connections between Kansas City's criminal underworld and corrupt politicians. If federal agents got Frank alone in an interrogation room, if they offered him a deal to reduce his sentence in exchange for information, Frank might talk. And if Frank talked, a lot of powerful people in Kansas City would go to prison. Lazia couldn't let that happen. He made a phone call. Then another. Within hours, a plan was set in motion. The goal wasn't to rescue Frank, that would be too difficult and too risky. The goal was to ensure Frank Nash never made it to a federal interrogation room. Dead men, after all, tell no tales. At approximately 7:13 a.m. on June 17, 1933, Agent Lackey and his team escorted Frank Nash out of Union Station's main entrance toward a line of cars waiting to take them to the train platform. Frank was in the middle of the group, his hands cuffed in front of him, surrounded by armed federal agents in local Kansas City. Police officers who'd been brought in to assist with the transfer. They were so focused on protecting their prisoner that they didn't notice the two cars pulling up to the curb about 50 feet away. They didn't see the men inside those cars raising Thompson's submachine guns. They didn't realize death was seconds away. One of the agents, Raymond Caffrey, was opening the back door of their vehicle to put Frank inside when a voice shouted from the approaching cars, "Let him have it." And then the world exploded in gunfire. The Thompson submachine guns, Tommy guns. In popular parlance, opened up with a sound like tearing cloth amplified 1,000 times. Bullets ripped through metal, shattered glass, and found flesh with devastating efficiency. The agents, caught completely by surprise, didn't even have time to draw their weapons before the first volley cut through them. Raymond Caffrey died instantly, his body torn apart by multiple rounds. Two Kansas City police officers, William Grooms and Frank Hermanson, fell seconds later, their blood pooling on the pavement. Agent Joe Lackey took a bullet to the spine that would leave him partially paralyzed for the rest of his life. And Frank Nash, the man this was all supposedly about, took 3 bullets to the head. He died still handcuffed, slumped in the back seat of the car he'd been about to enter. His blood and brains splattered across the interior. The golden teeth he'd been so proud of glinted in the morning sun as his body went limp. The entire massacre took less than 30 seconds. 15 shots, 4 dead law enforcement officers, 1 dead prisoner. The shooter's car screeched away from the curb and disappeared into Kansas City traffic before the stunned survivors could even process what had happened. In the immediate aftermath, chaos reigned. Civilians screamed and ran in every direction. The wounded agents tried to radio for help while applying pressure to their injuries. And in the back of that car, Frank Nash's body sat cooling, his empty eyes staring at nothing, his criminal career, ended not by justice or imprisonment, but by the same violence he dealt out for so many years. The question that would haunt investigators for decades was simple: who ordered the hit? And more importantly, was it meant to rescue Frank or silence him? The truth, when it finally emerged, would be more complicated than anyone imagined. Asterisk, the slaughter outside Union Station sent shockwaves through America. This wasn't a bank robbery gone wrong or a shootout between criminals.
No, this was a coordinated
assault on federal law enforcement officers in broad daylight in a major American city. It was, as J. Edgar Hoover would later call it in testimony before Congress, an act of war against the United States government. Within hours of the massacre, the Bureau of Investigation flooded Kansas City with agents. Director Hoover himself arrived on scene 2 days later, personally overseeing what would become the most extensive manhunt in the agency's history up to that point. The investigation would eventually employ over 1,500 agents, interview more than 20,000 people, and follow leads in over 24 states. But in those first chaotic hours and days, the Bureau didn't even know for certain who they were hunting. Witnesses gave conflicting descriptions of the shooters. Some said there were 2 men with Tommy guns. Others insisted they saw 3, maybe 4. The getaway cars had been found abandoned in different parts of the city, wiped clean of fingerprints. It was clear the attack had been planned and executed by professionals, but which professionals remained a mystery. The funeral for the slain officers drew thousands. Kansas City, embarrassed and horrified that such violence had occurred in their city, turned out in force to honor the dead. The newspaper headlines screamed for justice. Politicians demanded action. And J. Edgar Hoover, never one to waste a good crisis, used the massacre as justification for massively expanding the Bureau's powers and budget. But beneath the public, its outrage and political grandstanding, the real investigation was following a more disturbing trail. Agents interviewing witnesses discovered something troubling. Several Kansas City police officers had been seen talking to suspicious individuals near Union Station in the hours before the massacre. When investigators tried to interview these officers, they suddenly developed convenient amnesia or disappeared on unexpected vacations. The corruption went deeper than anyone had initially suspected. Kansas City wasn't just influenced by the mob, it was practically governed by it. The political machine of Tom Pendergast controlled everything from judges to beat cops, and his enforcer, Johnny Lazia, had infiltrated law enforcement so thoroughly that criminals often knew about police operations before the police themselves did. Agent Joe Lackey, recovering in a hospital bed from his spinal injury, provided crucial testimony. Despite his pain and partial paralysis, Lackey spent hours being debriefed by federal investigators. He told them about receiving the tip regarding Frank Nash's location, about the capture, about the decision to transfer Frank through Union Station, and he told them something that changed the entire investigation. In the hours after Frank's capture, before they'd even left for Union Station, Johnny Lazia had somehow known about the transfer plans. How is that possible? Investigators asked. You didn't announce it publicly. You took precautions to keep it quiet. Lackey's response was chilling, someone on our side told him. The investigation shifted. Now agents were looking not just at criminals, but at their own colleagues, at Kansas City Police, at anyone who might have had access to the transfer information. It was slow, painstaking work complicated by the fact that they couldn't trust local law enforcement to assist. Every interview had to be conducted by federal agents. Every piece of evidence had to be secured away from potentially corrupt local police. Meanwhile, the Bureau was getting pressure from Washington to produce results. To arrest someone, anyone, to show the American people that such violence wouldn't be tolerated. Hoover needed a narrative, a clear story of good versus evil, that the public could understand. And slowly, through thousands of interviews and investigative dedens, that narrative began to emerge. The primary suspects became Pretty Boy Floyd and his associate Adam Ricchetti. Floyd was already one of America's most wanted criminals, a bank robber with a reputation for violence who'd been operating throughout the Midwest. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen Floyd in Kansas City around the time of the massacre. A gangster, facing unrelated charges, offered to testify that Floyd had bragged about the Union Station job, but there was a problem. The evidence against Floyd was circumstantial at best, and some of it contradictory. Several reliable witnesses placed Floyd in another state entirely on the day of the massacre. Other witnesses who claimed to have seen him near Union Station gave descriptions that didn't match Floyd's appearance, and the gangster willing to testify against Floyd had a long history of lying to law enforcement in exchange for reduced sentences. None of that mattered to Hoover. He needed a victory, a face to put on the wanted posters, a name to give the press. Pretty Boy Floyd became the official suspect in the Kansas City Massacre, wanted dead or alive for the murder of federal agents in October 1934. Floyd was tracked down to a farm in Ohio and killed in a shootout with federal agents. His grave insisting he had nothing to do with Union Station, but the Bureau declared the case solved, just as they announced had been served. Except many of the agents who'd actually worked the case knew better. In private conversations, away from the press and the politicians, they acknowledged that Floyd probably wasn't at Union Station that morning. The real shooters were likely hired guns brought in by Johnny Lazia specifically for the job, professional. Killers with no connection to Floyd or other high-profile outlaws. And the real purpose of the massacre? According to the theory that many investigators came to believe, it wasn't a rescue attempt gone wrong. It was an assassination. Frank Nash knew too much. He'd worked for Lazia's organization. He'd seen how deeply corruption ran through Kansas. Cities, police, and political structures. If federal agents got him alone and offered him a deal, Frank might have talked to save himself from spending the rest of his life in prison. Lazia couldn't take that risk. Better to kill Frank and some federal agents, which would bring heat down on everyone involved, but couldn't be directly traced to Lazier than let Frank potentially destroy the entire Kansas City criminal empire with his testimony. It was a cold, brutal calculation. Frank Nash, who'd spent his entire adult life betraying others, was betrayed at the end by the very organization he'd worked for. The criminal underworld he'd been part of decided he was more valuable dead than alive, and they'd executed that decision with ruthless efficiency. Johnny Lazia himself didn't live long enough to face justice for his role, if any, in the massacre. In July 1934, just over a year after Union Station, Lazia was shot to death outside his home by unknown gunmen. Whether it was rival criminals, federal agents operating outside the law, or his own organization silencing him before he could talk, that remains a mystery to this day. The Kansas City Massacre fundamentally changed American law enforcement. Congress, horrified by the brazen attack, passed legislation that dramatically expanded federal authority. The Bureau of Investigation became the Federal Bureau of Investigation, with broader powers and more resources. Agents were authorized to carry firearms and make arrests for an expanded range of federal crimes. The era of the independent outlaw, the lone wolf criminal like Frank Nash, was effectively over. Organized crime and federal law enforcement would continue their dance for decades to come, but the rules had changed.
The government had demonstrated.
It would respond to violence against its agents with overwhelming force. And criminals learned that killing federal agents brought a level of heat that no amount of political corruption could shield them from. Frank Nash's body was transported back to Leavenworth, where prison officials identified it. Then, in a final irony, his remains were sent to Oklahoma for burial. The notorious train robber, the man who'd terrorized banks and railroads across the Midwest, was laid to rest in a simple grave in Linwood Cemetery. The funeral was small, attended by a few relatives and curiosity seekers. No fellow criminals came to pay their respects. It was too dangerous, and besides, in their world. Sentiment was a luxury no one could afford. The gold teeth Frank had been so proud of, the ones that led to his capture, were removed before burial. Some say they were kept as evidence. Others claim a funeral home employee pocketed them, selling them to a collector of macabre memorabilia. Like so many details of Frank Nash's life and death, the truth disappeared into the fog of history and legend in the years that followed. The Kansas City Massacre became a touchstone for discussions about crime, corruption, and federal power. Books were written, films were made, and Frank Nash transitioned from a real person into a symbol. character in America's ongoing mythology about outlaws and lawmen. But beneath the legend was a more complicated truth. Frank Nash wasn't a romantic figure or a Robin Hood character. He was a violent criminal who hurt people, who stole from banks not to feed the poor but to enrich himself, who left a trail of trauma and fear wherever he went. The woman in that first-class train car who had nightmares about his cold eyes didn't care about his childhood poverty or his quick mind. The bank tellers who flinched at sudden movements for years after he robbed them didn't romanticize his exploits. And the federal agents who died at Union Station, Raymond Caffrey, William Groom's Frank Hermanson, they left behind widows and children, families, destroyed by violence that Frank's criminal career had helped normalize and enable. These men weren't nameless obstacles in Frank's story. They were husbands, fathers, sons, people with lives and dreams who died doing their jobs. The Kansas City Massacre marked the end of an era in American crime. But it also marked the beginning of something new, a federal law enforcement apparatus. With the resources and authority to wage war against organized crime, the FBI that emerged from Union Station would eventually bring down the great criminal organizations of the mid-20th century. From the Italian mafia to corrupt political machines to domestic terrorist organizations. J. Edgar Hoover, for all his faults and abuses of power that would later come to light, understood something fundamental in the wake of the massacre. Criminals thrived when law enforcement was fragmented, localized, and easily corrupted. The solution was centralized federal authority that could cross state lines, couldn't be bought off by local crime bosses, that had the resources to pursue investigations for years if necessary, whether that was worth the cost of the expansion of federal surveillance, the eventual abuses of power, the creation of a law enforcement agency that sometimes operated above the law. It was meant to enforce remains a matter of debate. But there's no question that Frank Nash's death at Union Station was a hinge point in American history. A moment when the balance of power between criminals and law enforcement shifted decisively. Asterisk. The death of Frank Nash and the subsequent manhunt. For his killers reverberated through American society in ways that extended far beyond law enforcement. The Kansas City Massacre became a cultural touchstone, a moment that Americans would reference for generations when discussing crime, justice, and the role of federal power. But to truly understand Frank Nash's legacy, we need to look at what his life and death revealed about America itself in those turbulent decades between the world wars. Frank Nash's story is, in many ways, the story of America's transition from a rural, frontier society to an urban, industrial nation. He was born in the last gasps of the Old West, when outlaws like Jesse James and Billy the Kid still featured in recent memory. He came of age during the oil boom, that first great rush of industrial wealth that transformed the landscape and culture of Oklahoma and Arkansas. And he died at the dawn of the modern law enforcement era, killed by the very violence he'd spent his life perfecting. The romanticization of outlaws like Frank Nash tells us something important about American culture. Despite all evidence, too, the contrary, despite the victims and the violence and the very real harm these criminals caused, Americans have always had a fascination with the outlaw, the rebel who operates outside society's rules. During the Depression, when banks were foreclosing on farms and businesses, when the government seemed powerless to address economic catastrophe, criminals who robbed banks became folk heroes to some people. Woody Guthrie wrote songs celebrating. Pretty Boy Floyd is a friend to the common man, someone who fought back against institutions that were crushing ordinary Americans. Never mind that Floyd was a killer who'd murdered police officers and terrorized communities. The myth was more appealing than the reality. Frank Nash enjoyed similar, if less widespread, romanticization in the years after his death. Articles and pulp novels portrayed him as a clever operator, a man who'd outsmarted the authorities for years and lived life on his own terms. This romanticization ignores the human cost of Frank's crimes. Every bank he robbed served a community, held the savings and mortgages of farmers and shopkeepers and working families. When Frank and his crew terrorized bank employees at gunpoint, those people carried that trauma for the rest of their lives. When he pistol-whipped a train conductor or threatened passengers, he left psychological scars that never fully healed. His romantic partner? Frances Luce lived for decades after Frank's death. She never remarried, never fully escaped the shadow of her relationship with one of America's most notorious criminals. In interviews late in her life, she presented a complicated picture of Frank charming and generous one moment, cold and calculating the next. She described a man capable of great tenderness, who was also capable of looking at another human being as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. The families of the men killed at Union Station never received the justice they deserved. Pretty Boy Floyd's death provided closure of a sort, even if he wasn't actually the shooter. But the real architects of the massacre, the criminals who ordered it, the corrupt police who provided information about the transfer, the political bosses who enabled the environment where such violence was possible, most of them escaped consequences. Johnny Lazia's death in 1934 is likely connected to the Union Station fallout, but his killers were never caught. Tom Pendergast, the political boss who controlled Kansas City and whose machine Lazia enforced, eventually went to prison in 1939, not for the massacre or his criminal connections, but for tax evasion. He served just 15 months before being released on health grounds. Corrupt police officers, who likely provided information about Frank Nash's transfer, were never definitively identified or charged. This patterned violent criminals dying. Violent deaths, while the architects of corruption escaped justice, became a recurring theme in American organized crime. The men who pulled triggers or robbed banks faced bullets or prison, while the politicians and businessmen who enabled and profited from that crime often lived comfortable lives. Frank Nash's criminal career also illuminated the economic roots of crime in American society. He wasn't born evil or predisposed to violence. He was born poor, in a place and time where poverty meant genuine suffering, where children went hungry and families lost their farms to banks over debts they couldn't control. The America Frank grew up and offered very limited paths to prosperity for someone from his background, so you could break your back doing physical labor for wages that barely kept you alive. You could try to make it as a farmer and hope the weather, the market, and the banks all cooperated. You could take what you wanted at gunpoint. This isn't to excuse Frank's choices. Plenty of people grew up in similar circumstances and didn't become violent criminals. But it is to acknowledge that crime doesn't emerge from a vacuum. The early 20th century American economy created vast inequalities, offered limited social mobility, and then was shocked when some people decided to redistribute wealth through robbery rather than waiting for it to trickle down. The professionalization of Franks criminal operation also foreshadowed the future of organized crime in America. Early in his career, Frank operated like the outlaws of the Old West, planning small jobs with trusted partners, hitting targets of opportunity, staying one step ahead of local law enforcement. But by the end of his career, he'd evolved into something closer to a modern criminal enterprise with networks of specialists, inside information sources, and connections to organized crime syndicates. Had Frank lived, had the Union Station Massacre never happened, he likely would have continued. Transitioning into this more organized model of crime, his skills as a planner and his connections throughout the criminal underworld made him valuable to organizations like Johnny Lazia's Kansas City operation or the Chicago outfit. The day of the independent bank robber was ending, but the era of organized crime was just beginning. Frank had the adaptability to make that transition. Asterisk the FBI that emerged from the Kansas City Massacre also carried forward Frank Nash's legacy in unexpected ways. Hoover's Bureau adopted many of the tactics that criminals like Frank had pioneered. Careful planning, intelligence gathering, networks of informants. In an understanding that successful operations required thinking several steps ahead of your opponent. The FBI also adopted what we might call the professionalization of law enforcement, just as Frank had approached crime as a profession requiring specific skills and knowledge. The FBI approached law enforcement the same way. Agents were trained extensively, specialized in different areas, and operated according to carefully developed procedures and protocols. In a strange way, criminals like Frank Nash forced law enforcement to evolve. When outlaws were simple bank robbers hitting small-town banks and fleeing to the next county, local sheriffs could handle them. But when criminals began operating across state lines, using modern technology like automobiles and telecommunications, coordinating with organized crime networks local law enforcement couldn't cope. Federal intervention became necessary. This created the modern American law enforcement landscape we still live with. Patchwork of local, state, and federal agencies with overlapping jurisdictions and sometimes competing interests, all theoretically. Working together to combat crime, but often engaged in turf battles and jurisdictional disputes. Asterisk. The legal changes prompted by Union Station also had lasting effects. The expansion of federal jurisdiction, the arming of federal agents, the increased penalties for crimes against federal officers, these changes, made in the heat of the moment after a shocking act of violence, permanently altered the relationship between federal and state power in America. Civil. Libertarians have long argued that the Kansas City Massacre and similar incidents were used to justify expansions of federal power that went beyond what was necessary or constitutional. The FBI's later abuse is illegal wiretapping, harassment of civil rights leaders, COINTELPRO operations against political dissidents, can trace their legal and institutional roots to the authorities granted in the wake of Union Station. This is perhaps Frank Nash's most complex legacy. His death became the justification for federal powers that, while used to combat organized crime, were also used to target political movements and individuals that the federal government deemed threatening. The tools built to catch bank robbers and gangsters were eventually turned on anti-war protesters, civil rights activists, and political dissidents. But we should be careful not to blame Frank Nash for how others later abused the powers. Granted, in response to his death, that's a different moral calculus, a different set of choices made by different actors. Frank was responsible for his crimes, for the people he hurt, for the fear and trauma he inflicted. The government officials who later abused their authority, in his name, bear responsibility for their own actions. In the decades after his death, Frank Nash largely faded from popular memory. Unlike contemporaries like John, Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, or Pretty Boy Floyd, Frank never captured the public imagination in quite the same way. Perhaps it was because he died as a victim rather than going out in a blaze of glory. Perhaps it was because his story was too complicated to bound up in corruption and betrayal. To fit neatly into the outlaw hero narrative Americans preferred, the few photos that survive of Frank show a man who doesn't quite match the legend. He wasn't particularly handsome or imposing. He looked like what he was, a middle-aged man from rural America who'd chosen a violent path and paid the price for it. The gold teeth that led to his capture, the slicked-back hair that gave him his nickname. The expensive suits he favored in his later years, these were the accoutrements of a man who wanted desperately to be someone important. Someone feared and respected. In the end, Frank got what he wanted. People feared him. His name meant something in the criminal underworld. But the respect he craved, the legacy he hoped to build, those eluded him. He's remembered today, if he's remembered at all, not for his crimes, but for his death. Not for what he did, but for what was done to him. The Union Station Plaza in Kansas City today features a memorial to the officers killed in the massacre. Their names are carved in stone: Raymond Caffrey, William Grooms, Frank Hermanson. Otto Red, another officer who died shortly after from his wounds. These men are remembered as heroes, as men who died in the line of duty protecting the public. Frank. Nash's grave in Oklahoma, by contrast, is unmarked by any grand monument, just a simple headstone with his name and dates. No one leaves flowers, no pilgrims come to pay their respects. The rain and wind slowly wear away even that simple marker, erasing his name letter by letter, year by year. There's a lesson in that contrast. A reminder that we choose what we memorialize and what we let fade into obscurity. We build monuments to the officers who died fighting crime, and we let the criminals who caused that violence disappear into unmarked graves and forgotten footnotes. But perhaps the most important part of Frank Nash's legacy isn't about him at all. It's about all. The people affected by his choices and by the choices made in response to his death, the families of his victims who lived with loss and trauma, the communities terrorized by his robberies, the law enforcement officers who died at Union Station, politicians and reformers who used the massacre to push for changes they'd wanted for other reasons, the corrupt officials who escaped justice, the federal agents who built careers on hunting criminals like Frank. All of these people, all of these stories radiate out from the central fact of Frank Nash's violent life and violent death. His legacy is written not just in the crimes he committed, but in the society those crimes helped shape, in the laws passed and the institutions built in response to men like him. And perhaps that's the real tragedy of Frank Nash's story. He spent his entire adult life trying to be someone important, someone who mattered. In the end, he achieved that goal, but not in any way he would have wanted. He mattered not as a person, but as a problem, not as an individual, but as a symbol of everything that was wrong with him. America in those turbulent decades between the wars, he wanted to be remembered. He is, but only as a cautionary tale, a footnote in the larger story of American crime and justice. He wanted to leave a legacy. He did, but it's a legacy of violence, corruption, and the expansion of federal power that continues to shape American society nearly a century later. Asterisk. To understand the full scope of Frank Nash's impact on American criminal history, we need to examine the men who orbited his life, the criminals who worked with him, the lawmen who hunted him, and the corrupt officials who enabled his career. These men, often more obscure than Frank himself, tell us as much about the era as the famous outlaw does, Tommy Holden. Frank's partner in the Leavenworth escape represented a different breed of criminal than Frank. Where Frank was driven by a need for respect and recognition, Tommy was a pure technician. He loved the craft of safe-cracking, the way an artist loves painting. When he and Frank escaped together, Tommy could have stayed with Frank, forming a partnership that might have rivaled any criminal duo of the era. Instead, Tommy went his own way, pulling off sophisticated burglaries across the Midwest with a precision that frustrated law enforcement for years. Tommy was eventually captured in 1932, sent back to Leavenworth, and then transferred to Alcatraz when that maximum security facility opened. He spent over 20 years in federal prison, long, enough to see the entire world change around him. When he was finally released in the 1950s, Tommy found himself in an America that had no place for men like him. The Depression was over. The war had been won. The country had moved on. He died in 1953, just months after his release, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. But perhaps the most fascinating character in Frank Nash's orbit was a man named Harvey Bailey, often called the Dean of American bank robbers. Bailey was to bank robbery what a master chess player is to the game always, thinking several moves ahead, never taking unnecessary risks, treating crime as a profession requiring discipline and expertise. Bailey and Frank crossed paths several times during their criminal careers, sometimes working together, sometimes operating in parallel. Bailey had a code of conduct that seems almost quaint by modern standards. He never robbed banks on Mondays because that's when working people cashed their paychecks, and he didn't want to steal from ordinary folks. Of local crisis or disaster, he was scrupulously honest in dividing loot among his crew, and he never, ever killed anyone during his robberies. This last point was crucial. Bailey believed that killing during robberies brought heat that no amount of planning could evade. Murder turned robbery into a capital crime, turned local law enforcement into zealots determined to catch you at any cost, and eliminated any public sympathy you might otherwise enjoy. Bailey managed to pull off dozens of bank robberies over decades without firing a shot at anyone. His guns, he said, were for show, not for use. Frank Nash lacked Bailey's discipline. Frank would pistol whip witnesses who annoyed him, would threaten violence at the slightest provocation. This difference in temperament ultimately determined their different fates. While Frank died in a hail of bullets at 46, Bailey lived. To be 79, dying peacefully in 1979, after serving his time and living quietly in retirement, the lawmen who hunted Frank also deserve examination. Joe Lackey, the federal agent who finally captured Frank, was left partially paralyzed by the Union Station Massacre. He could have retired on disability, could have lived quietly as a victim of that terrible day. Instead, he spent the rest of his career with the Bureau, training younger agents. lecturing on officer safety and advocating for better protections for law enforcement. In interviews later in life, Lackey spoke about Frank with a strange mixture of respect and contempt. He respected Frank's intelligence and planning abilities, while being utterly contemptuous of his violence and lack of moral compass. Lackey believed that men like Frank chose crime not because society failed them, but because they were fundamentally selfish people who valued their own enrichment over the welfare of others. This perspective contrasts sharply with the more sociological analysis that gained prominence later in the 20th century. The idea that crime is primarily a symptom of social and economic dysfunction. Lackey, like many lawmen of his era, saw crime as a moral choice. Poverty didn't make you rob banks. Plenty of poor people stayed honest. Difficult circumstances didn't make you violent. Plenty of people faced hardship without hurting others. Frank Nash, in Lackey's view, chose his path. That choice was worthy of judgment and punishment. Then there was William Billy Roff, the federal marshal who'd pursued Frank for years before Lackey's capture. Roff represented old-school law enforcement, a man who'd started his career in the Wild West era and adapted to modern policing methods. He'd once tracked outlaws on horseback across barren territory. By the end of his career, he was coordinating multi-state investigations using telephones and telegraph systems. Roff retired shortly after the Kansas City Massacre, citing the violence as a final straw in a career that had seen too much bloodshed. In his retirement, he wrote a memoir that's largely forgotten today, but provides valuable insights into law enforcement during the transition from frontier justice to modern policing. In it, he wrote about Frank Nash with something approaching sympathy, seeing him as a product of circumstances that might have turned out differently with different choices at critical moments. Nash was smart enough to have been anything he wanted. Roff wrote, a businessman, a lawyer, a politician, he had the mind for it. But somewhere along the way, he convinced himself that the world owed him something, that the rules didn't apply to him. And once a man convinces himself of that, once he decides he's above the law, there's no reasoning with him. You can only stop him. On the other side of the equation were the corrupt officials who enabled Frank's career. Kansas City in the 1920s and early 1930s was run by a political machine so corrupt it makes modern political scandals look amateurish by comparison. Tom Pendergast controlled every aspect of city government, from the mayor's office to the police department to the municipal. Courts Pendergast was a complicated figure. He wasn't a traditional gangster. He didn't rob banks or kill people. He was a political boss who understood that power came from controlling the machinery of government, and that controlling that machinery required money. The money came from vice, gambling, prostitution, illegal alcohol during Prohibition, and from skimming public contracts and selling government positions to the highest bidder. Men like Frank Nash were valuable to Pendergast, not because of the banks they robbed, but because they provided muscle when needed and because their criminal networks could be tapped for various illegal services. In return, Pendergast's machine provided protection. Police would look the other way. Judges would dismiss charges, and when federal heat became too intense, the machine would help criminals escape or hide. This symbiotic relationship between organized crime and political corruption was the real story of the era, more significant than any individual bank robbery. Frank Nash was a symptom of a larger disease of society where the institutions meant to enforce law and maintain order were themselves corrupted by the very criminals they were supposed to be fighting. Johnny Lazia, Pendergast's enforcer, was the direct link between political power and criminal violence. Lazia had started as a street tough and worked his way up to become the de facto crime boss of Kansas City. He controlled the police force through a combination of bribery and intimidation. Officers who cooperated got promoted and received extra payments. Officers who didn't cooperate found themselves transferred to undesirable positions or facing manufactured disciplinary charges. When the Kansas City Massacre happened, federal investigators quickly realized that Lazia must have had advanced knowledge of Frank Nash's transfer, the coordination of the attack, the timing. The fact that the shooters knew exactly where and when to strike all of it pointed to inside information, but proving it was another matter. Witnesses were afraid to talk. Physical evidence was scarce, and the political protection Lazia enjoyed meant that investigating him too aggressively could end an agent's career. Lazia's death in 1934, less than a year after Union Station, removed a key piece of the puzzle. Was he killed to silence him? Before federal investigators could build a case, was it a power play by rivals in the Kansas City Underworld? Or was it simply bad luck, a random act of violence in a violent world? The truth died with Lazia, and the men who killed him were never identified. The FBI agents who worked the Union Station investigation faced challenges that are hard to imagine today. There was no DNA analysis, no digital surveillance, no forensic techniques beyond basic fingerprinting and ballistics. Witnesses had to be interviewed in person. Records had to be searched by hand. And every lead had to be followed physically rather than through databases or computer searches. The agents also faced a culture of silence and intimidation. In Kansas City's underworld, talking to federal agents was a death sentence. Witnesses who might have provided crucial information were too afraid to come forward. Those who did talk often recanted their stories or disappeared before trials. The investigation had to navigate not just the criminals themselves, but an entire ecosystem of fear, corruption, and loyalty that protected those criminals. Despite these obstacles, the FBI did eventually build a comprehensive picture of Frank Nash's criminal network and the broader Kansas City crime scene. They identified the players, mapped the relationships, and documented the corruption. But translating that knowledge into prosecutions proved nearly impossible. By the time they had enough evidence to indict anyone, most of the key figures were either dead or had fled to jurisdictions where they couldn't be extradited. One FBI agent who worked the case, a man named Sam McKee, spent 3 years investigating the Union Station Massacre and the broader Kansas City corruption. In his later writings, he described the frustration of knowing who committed crimes, but being unable to prove it in court, of watching guilty men walk free because witnesses were too afraid to testify or because evidence had been tampered with by corrupt local officials. "We knew who ordered the hit on Nash," McKee wrote in an internal bureau memo that was declassified decades later. "We knew who pulled the triggers. We knew which police officers provided the information about the transfer. But knowing and proving are two different things. And in Kansas City in 1933, the gap between those two things was unbridgeable. This gap between knowing the truth and being able to prove it legally was perhaps the greatest legacy of Frank Nash's era. It demonstrated the limitations of law enforcement when facing organized, well-funded, politically connected criminal enterprises. And it provided the justification for the expansion of federal powers that would characterize the next several decades of American law enforcement. The men in the shadows of Frank Nash's story, the criminals, the lawmen, the corrupt officials were all actors in a larger drama about American society in transition. They lived in a time when the rules were being rewritten, when the frontier was closing, but the modern era hadn't quite arrived, when traditional values competed with new realities. Frank Nash himself understood this in his own way. In one of the few interviews he ever gave, conducted by a newspaper reporter who managed to track him down in a hot springs bathhouse in 1928, Frank spoke about the changing nature of crime in America. "The old ways are dying," he said. To be a man could rob a bank, and if he was smart about it, if he didn't get greedy, he could disappear and live his life. But now, they got telephones and telegraphs, they got cars that can chase you, they've got federal laws that let them cross state lines. It's getting harder every year. Pretty soon there won't be any independent operators left. It'll all be big organizations like businesses, because that's the only way to have enough protection and enough resources to stay ahead of the law. Frank was right. Within a decade of his death, the era of the independent bank robber was essentially over. The criminals who survived and prospered in the 1940s and beyond were those who joined organized crime families, who operated as part of larger criminal enterprises with legitimate business fronts and political connections. The men in the shadows of Frank Nash's life each chose different paths through this changing landscape. Some adapted and survived. Others, like Frank, held on to the old ways and paid the price. and the law enforcement officers who hunted them evolved as well, building new institutions and developing new techniques to combat the changing face of crime. In the end, the story of these men criminals and lawmen alike is a story about adaptation and survival, about men trying to navigate a world that was changing faster than they could fully comprehend. Frank Nash's tragedy was that he was smart enough to see the changes coming, but too stubborn or too committed to his path to change with them. Asterisk, the sun set on Frank Nash's era. But the shadows he cast extended far beyond his death. To understand the final chapter of his legacy, we need to follow those shadows into the decades that followed, examining how his life and death influenced American crime, law enforcement, and culture. The immediate aftermath of the Kansas City Massacre saw a fundamental transformation in federal law enforcement. The Bureau of Investigation became the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1935, with expanded powers and a new mandate to combat interstate crime. Congress passed a series of laws that became known as the New Deal for Crime, federalizing offenses that had previously been state matters. The FBI that emerged from this transformation was J. Edgar Hoover's vision made real a professional, centralized, scientifically oriented law enforcement agency that could pursue criminals across state lines and bring the full weight of federal resources to bear. Hoover used the Kansas City Massacre relentlessly in his public relations campaigns, turning the dead agents into martyrs and Frank Nash into a symbol of everything the new FBI would fight against. But Hoover's FBI also inherited something troubling from the era of Frank Nash: a willingness to operate in moral gray areas when pursuing objectives. Just as Frank had justified his crimes as responses to an unjust economic system, the FBI would later justify illegal surveillance, harassment of political dissidents, and even outright criminal acts as necessary tools in fighting crime and maintaining national security. This parallel isn't meant to equate bank robbers with law enforcement, but rather to point out how the logic of ends justifying means, once accepted, can corrupt both criminals and those who fight them. Frank Nash broke laws because he believed the system was rigged against people like him. The FBI broke laws because they believed criminals like Frank Nash required extraordinary measures to combat. Both positions contain elements of truth and elements of dangerous self-justification. The criminals who survived Frank's era learned from his mistakes. They professionalized, organized, and went legitimate wherever possible. The Italian mafia families that dominated American organized crime from the 1940s through the 1980s operated legitimate businesses alongside their criminal enterprises. They laundered money through legal channels. They hired lawyers and accountants. They understood that the path to long-term criminal success ran through the boardroom as much as through the back alley. Meyer Lansky, the financial genius of organized crime, once said, "We're bigger than us steel." He meant it literally. The combined revenues of organized crime in the 1950s exceeded the revenues of America's largest corporation. This was a far cry from Frank Nash's world of individual bank robberies and train heists. Came after Frank operated on a scale he couldn't have imagined, but they did so precisely because they learned from his generation's failures. The one lesson they learned above all: violence against law enforcement brings heat that no amount of political corruption can shield you from. After the Kansas City Massacre, organized crime became much more careful about killing police or federal agents. It still happened, but rarely, and when it did, the organizations involved usually made efforts to distance themselves from the hit, and sometimes even helped law enforcement find the triggerman too, deflect attention from the bosses who'd ordered it in popular culture. Frank Nash's era became romanticized in ways that would have puzzled the people who lived through it. Prohibition era, the Depression, the bank robbers and gangsters, all of it was sanitized, smoothed out and packaged for entertainment. Movies turned brutal killers into charming antiheroes. Books presented bank robbers as Robin Hood, figures fighting against corrupt institutions. This romanticization peaked in the 1960s and 1970s, when films like Bonnie and Clyde presented Depression-era criminals as rebels against an oppressive system. The real Bonnie and Clyde were young, violent killers who murdered police officers and civilians. The film version were beautiful people fighting against the man. Frank Nash never got the full Hollywood treatment. But he benefited from the general cultural shift that viewed all Depression-era outlaws through rose-tinted glasses. The communities that Frank terrorized remembered a different story. In small Oklahoma towns where Frank had robbed banks, elderly residents could still recall the fear, the trauma, the sense of violation when men with guns burst into the places where they kept their life savings. These weren't romantic adventures to the people who lived through them. They were terrifying experiences that left lasting psychological scars. One woman, interviewed in the 1970s for a local history project, recalled being in a bank when Frank's crew robbed it in 1923. She was 7 years old, there with her mother to deposit money from selling eggs. When the robbers burst in, her mother had thrown herself over her daughter to protect her. "I can still hear my mother praying," the woman said. "I can still feel how hard she was shaking. And I can still see that man's eyes over his mask, looking at us like we were nothing, like we were just things in his way. That wasn't any Robin Hood, that was a monster." These competing narratives, the romantic outlaw versus the brutal criminal, have never been fully reconciled in American culture. We simultaneously celebrate and condemn our outlaws, seeing them as both freedom fighters and menaces to society. Frank Nash embodies this contradiction. He was undeniably intelligent and skilled at what he did. He was also undeniably a violent criminal who hurt innocent people. The technical innovations of Frank's era also left lasting impacts. The use of automobiles as getaway vehicles, the coordination of criminal activities across state lines, the development of criminal intelligence networks, all of these became standard operating procedure for organized crime. Law enforcement, in turn, developed countermeasures, interstate communication systems, vehicle pursuit techniques, and coordination between different jurisdictions. This arms race between criminals and law enforcement is driven by technological change and organizational innovation continues to this day. Modern cybercriminals use techniques that would have been science fiction in Frank Nash's time. But the basic dynamic remains the same. Criminals develop new methods. Law enforcement adapts. Criminals innovate again. Frank's personal story also offers insights into the psychology of career criminals. His need for respect, his inability to accept authority, his willingness to use violence to achieve his goals, these aren't unique to Frank or his era. Talk to law enforcement professionals today. They'll tell you they still encounter criminals with similar psychological profiles. Intelligent people who could have succeeded in legitimate careers, but who chose crime because it offered a sense of power and control they couldn't find elsewhere. The tragedy of Frank Nash, from this perspective, is how much potential he wasted. His quick mind, his organizational skills, his ability to plan and execute complex operations, these talents could have made him successful in legitimate business. Instead, he channeled them into crime, and it cost him everything. But perhaps Frank never wanted a legitimate career. Perhaps the danger, the violence, the outsider status, perhaps those were features, not bugs, of the criminal life for him. Some people are drawn to the dark not because they can't succeed in the light, but because the dark is where they feel at home. The Kansas City of today bears little resemblance to the corrupt, violent city where Frank Nash died. Union Station has been restored and serves as a tourist attraction with museums and exhibits. The memorial to the agents killed in the massacre is visited by law enforcement personnel from around the country. The political machine that once controlled the city is long gone, swept away by reforms and federal investigations. But the deeper issues that Frank's life and death illuminate: economic inequality, the relationship between crime and poverty, the corrupting influence of money on politics and law enforcement, the tension between individual liberty and collective security. These issues remain very much alive. We still debate how much poverty and inequality drive crime. We still struggle with corruption in law enforcement and politics. We still wrestle with how much power we should give federal authorities to combat crime and threats to public safety. We still romanticize outlaws while condemning their actual Crimes. Frank Nash's story offers no easy answers to these questions. It does, however, offer a case study in how these forces interact, how individual choices and systemic failures combine to create violence and tragedy in the small cemetery. In Oklahoma, where Frank is buried, his grave receives few visitors. Most people who walk past don't even notice it. The stone is weathered, the inscription fading. The man buried beneath it, forgotten by all but a few historians and true crime enthusiasts. Perhaps that's fitting. Frank Nash spent his life trying to be somebody important, someone people would remember. He achieved a kind of fame, but it was fleeting, and the memory of him that survives is not the one he would have wanted. He's remembered when he's remembered at all, as a cautionary tale, a symbol of a violent era, a footnote in the larger story of American crime. The 4 federal agents and police officers who died at Union Station have a different kind of memorial. Their names are spoken at FBI training ceremonies. Their photographs hang in the halls of law enforcement institutions. Their sacrifice is invoked when discussing the dangers officers face and the need to protect those who protect us. This contrast in how we memorialize heroes versus criminals says something important about our values as a society. We choose to honor those who served, to remember those who gave their lives protecting others. And we choose to let the criminals fade into obscurity, denying them the fame they craved in life. Yet we can't fully escape the shadow of men like Frank Nash. His story, and stories like his, continue to fascinate us because they touch something deep in the American psyche. The outlaw, the rebel, the man who makes his own rules. This archetype is woven into our national mythology. From the frontier era to the present day, understanding this fascination, acknowledging it while not surrendering to it, is perhaps the final lesson of Frank Nash's legacy. If we can study these men, can try to understand what drove them, can even find certain aspects of their stories compelling, without romanticizing the violence they inflicted or the harm they caused. Frank Nash was a product of his time, shaped by forces larger than himself: poverty, economic upheaval, the transition from frontier society to industrial nation. But he was also a man who made choices, who decided that his desires mattered, more than the laws and social contracts that bind communities together, who used violence as a tool to get what he wanted. In the end, those choices defined him, not his intelligence, not his planning skills, not his ability to evade capture for so many years, but his choice to hurt others for personal gain, and his ultimate inability to escape the consequences of that choice. The Gunpowder legacy Frank Nash left behind is written in the laws passed, the institutions built, and the lives destroyed. It's written in the memorial at Union Station and in the unmarked grave in Oklahoma. It's written in FBI training manuals and in the fading memories of people who lived through his era. But perhaps most importantly, it's written in the ongoing. Americans struggle to balance freedom and order, to address the conditions that breed crime without excusing criminals, to celebrate our rebellious spirit without romanticizing those who truly rebel against basic human decency. Frank Nash believed he could beat the system, could take what he wanted, and escape the consequences. He was wrong. The system, for all its flaws and failures, ultimately caught up with him. Not through the prison walls he escaped, but through the very violence he'd made his life's work. He lived by the gun. He died by the gun. And in that simple, brutal symmetry lies whatever lesson his story has to teach us. The rain that falls on Frank Nash's grave in Oklahoma doesn't care about his story. It doesn't care about the banks he robbed, the people he hurt, or the legend he tried to build. Rain just falls, eroding stone, washing away memory, returning everything eventually to dust. But we who are still here, still trying to understand these dark chapters of American history, we care. We remember. We study these stories not to celebrate violence, but to understand it. Not to romanticize criminals, but to comprehend how ordinary people become extraordinary monsters, and how societies create the conditions where such transformations become possible. Frank Nash's Gunpowder legacy is a warning and a lesson. A warning about the seductive nature of violence, about how easily intelligence can be channeled toward destruction rather than creation, A lesson about the high cost of crime, not just for victims, but for the criminals themselves who sacrifice their humanity in pursuit of respect and power. If you've made it this far in Frank Nash's story, you've spent time in the shadows with me, walking through the darkest corners of American criminal history. I hope it's been worth your time. I hope you've learned something, felt something, understood something you didn't before. This channel exists to tell these stories: the gangsters, the outlaws, the criminals who shaped American history in ways both obvious and hidden. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Frank Nash's life and legacy, then make sure to subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when I post a new story from the shadows of history. And please leave a comment. Tell me what you thought of Frank Nash's story. Tell me if you'd heard of him before, or if the Kansas City Massacre was news to you. Tell me what other criminals and outlaws you'd like me to cover in future videos. Share this video with anyone you know who loves true crime, who's fascinated by American history, or who just appreciates a well-told story. These tales need to be remembered, even if the men who live them don't deserve to be celebrated, because at the end of the day, that's what keeps me researching, writing, sharing these stories. You, this community we're building together, one dark tale at a time. Frank Nash wanted to be remembered. He is, but not in the way he imagined. The lawmen who died stopping him are remembered too as heroes who gave their lives in service of something larger than themselves. Which legacy would you rather leave? Which story would you rather be part of? The answer to that question is the real lesson of Frank Nash's Gunpowder legacy. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And remember, the shadows of history have many more stories to tell. And I'll be here to guide you through them. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and never stop questioning the legends we tell ourselves. About heroes and villains, outlaws and lawmen, and the thin line that sometimes separates them. Subscribe now, and I'll see you in the shadows.